You're walking through a minefield, but the mines are invisible and the explosion happens in your mind. Every day you navigate through psychological traps so perfectly designed that you don't just fall into them, you build them yourself. Convince yourself they're safe spaces, and then defend them against anyone who suggests they might be dangerous. These aren't the obvious manipulations you've been warned about. These are the sophisticated snares that exploit the very mechanisms your brain uses to protect itself. I am the cartographer of your mental landscape, and today I'm going to show you the hidden territories where your own psychology becomes your enemy, where your strengths become your weaknesses, where your survival instincts become your destruction. Don't try to steel yourself against this. The armor you think protects you is actually the very thing that makes you vulnerable. Your defenses are precisely calibrated to fail against these traps because these traps were designed by the same evolutionary forces that created your defenses. You think you're sophisticated, aware, too smart to be manipulated. That confidence isn't protection. It's the targeting system these traps use to lock onto you. The more intelligent you are, the more elaborate the trap your mind will construct to catch you. The more self-aware you become, the more blind spots you create for yourself to hide in. In the next few minutes, you'll discover that every psychological strength you possess has a corresponding weakness so perfectly matched that using your strength automatically activates your vulnerability, like a key that opens a lock, but the lock is a trap door, and the fall is into your own unconscious mind. These aren't the crude manipulations of amateur con artists or obvious propaganda techniques you learn to spot in school. These are the masterpiece deceptions that your own brain crafts to deceive itself. They're not external threats. They're internal features operating exactly as designed, just with consequences you never intended. The terrifying part isn't that you fall into these traps. The terrifying part is that you're constantly falling into them while feeling completely certain that you're standing on solid ground. Your sense of stability, your feeling of being in control, your confidence in your own judgment. All of this can be perfectly intact while you're completely trapped. You're about to learn that the human mind doesn't just have bugs. It has features that function as bugs, flaws that serve a purpose, weaknesses that exist because they were once strengths. And the most dangerous traps are the ones that feel like freedom. Every civilization that has ever existed has fallen into collective versions of these same psychological traps. Every individual who has ever lived has spent their life caught in personal versions of these mental snares. They're not anomalies or accidents. They're the inevitable result of consciousness trying to understand itself using tools that aren't designed for self-examination. Welcome to the museum of your own mental vulnerabilities, where every exhibit is something you recognize, but something you've never seen clearly. Where every display case contains a part of your own psychology that you thought you understood, but was actually understanding you. The first trap is the most insidious because it masquerades as wisdom itself. I call it the certainty camouflage, and it transforms your need for knowledge into a weapon against knowing. Here's how it works. Your brain is designed to reduce uncertainty because uncertainty meant death for your ancestors. When you don't know if that rustling bush contains a predator or just wind, hesitation kills you. So evolution gave you a brain that jumps to conclusions, fills in missing information, and creates confident narratives from incomplete data. This was perfect for surviving in ancient environments. But in the modern world, this same mechanism becomes a sophisticated trap that convinces you that you know things you don't know, understand things you don't understand, and have figured out things that are actually figuring you out. Watch how this trap operates in your daily life. Someone presents you with a complex political issue, and within seconds, you have an opinion. Not because you've carefully analyzed all the relevant information, but because your brain automatically sorts it into pre-existing categories and generates the appropriate emotional response. You feel informed, but you're actually just responding to triggers. The trap gets more sophisticated when you encounter information that contradicts your established beliefs. Instead of updating your understanding, the certainty camouflage activates confirmation bias, motivated reasoning, and selective attention. You don't just ignore contradictory evidence. You unconsciously seek out and create evidence that supports what you already believe. But here's where it becomes truly diabolical. The trap convinces you that this process is actually critical thinking. When you dismiss evidence that challenges your worldview, it feels like intellectual rigor. When you find information that confirms your biases, it feels like validation of your intelligence. The trap transforms intellectual laziness into a sense of intellectual superiority. You've experienced this recently, haven't you? Think about the last time someone presented you with information that contradicted something you believed strongly. Notice how quickly your mind generated reasons why that information was wrong, biased, or irrelevant. Notice how good it felt to find those reasons. That feeling of satisfaction wasn't truth, recognizing truth. It was the trap rewarding you for staying trapped. The certainty camouflage doesn't just affect your opinions about external topics. It affects your understanding of yourself. When you have an emotional reaction, you immediately create a story about why you reacted that way. When you make a decision, you construct a narrative about your reasoning process. When you behave in ways that contradict your self-image, you generate explanations that preserve your self-concept. But these stories aren't accurate records of what actually happened in your mind. They're post hoc narratives designed to make you feel like you understand yourself, even when your actual motivations are unconscious, contradictory, or irrational. The trap is so effective because it provides exactly what your brain craves most: the feeling of understanding. It doesn't matter if the understanding is accurate, complete, or useful. As long as it reduces the discomfort of uncertainty, your brain will embrace it, defend it, and use it as the foundation for further false certainties. This creates what psychologists call the Dunning-Kruger effect, but it's actually much more widespread than most people realize. It's not just that incompetent people are overconfident. It's that all people, regardless of competence level, are vulnerable to overconfidence in domains where they have incomplete information, which is almost every domain that matters. The most tragic aspect of the certainty camouflage is that it prevents you from developing actual wisdom. True understanding requires comfort with uncertainty, ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, and willingness to change your mind when presented with better information. But the trap makes all of these feel threatening rather than liberating. You cannot escape this trap through more information or better education. In fact, more information often makes the trap more sophisticated. Educated people don't fall for fewer psychological traps. They fall for more elegant versions of the same traps. Their knowledge becomes a more convincing camouflage for their ignorance. The only way to work with the certainty camouflage is to recognize it operating in real time, which requires a level of metacognitive awareness that the trap is specifically designed to prevent. It's like trying to see your own blind spot. Possible, but only through indirect methods that feel counterintuitive and uncomfortable. The second trap is even more sophisticated because it weaponizes your own growth against you. I call it the progress paradox, and it turns your desire for self-improvement into a prison of perpetual inadequacy. This trap operates on a simple but devastating principle. It convinces you that you're always almost there, but never quite there yet. That you're making progress, but there's always more progress to make. That you're getting better, but you're not good enough. That the solution to your problems is just one more book, one more technique, one more insight away. Here's how it hooks you. You genuinely do make some improvement in your life. Maybe you read a self-help book and apply some techniques that actually help. Maybe you go to therapy and gain some insights that change your behavior. Maybe you adopt a spiritual practice that brings you peace. The improvement is real, measurable, significant. But instead of satisfaction, you experience a new form of hunger. The progress itself creates an awareness of how much further you could go, how much more you could improve, how much potential you're still not fulfilling. What felt like arrival becomes a new starting point. What felt like solution becomes evidence of how much is still unsolved. The trap transforms every success into proof of inadequacy. You lose weight, but now you're aware of how much more you could lose. You improve your relationship skills, but now you're conscious of how much more sophisticated your emotional intelligence could become. You develop mindfulness, but now you're aware of how many moments you're still unconscious. This wouldn't be problematic if it led to sustainable, enjoyable growth. But the progress paradox specifically prevents that. It keeps you in a state of chronic almost satisfaction, where you're always chasing the next level of improvement instead of enjoying the improvements you've already made. The trap is particularly insidious in the modern self-improvement industry, which has weaponized this psychological vulnerability into a business model. Every book promises to be the one that finally gives you what you need. Every seminar claims to offer the missing piece. Every guru suggests they have the ultimate answer, and some of them do provide genuine value, which makes the trap more convincing. You start to develop what I call improvement addiction, a compulsive need to constantly be working on yourself, reading about personal development, seeking new insights, trying new techniques. But this isn't actually self-improvement anymore. It's a sophisticated form of self-avoidance disguised as self-development. The paradox is that the more you focus on improving yourself, the more inadequate you feel. The more you learn about personal growth, the more you become aware of your limitations. The more you work on yourself, the more you create an identity based on being someone who needs work. This creates a particularly cruel double bind. If you stop trying to improve, you feel like you're settling for mediocrity. But if you keep trying to improve, you never feel good enough. The trap has eliminated both satisfaction and peace of mind, replacing them with chronic striving that feels meaningful but never delivers lasting fulfillment. The progress paradox also affects how you relate to others. You start categorizing people based on how conscious or developed they are. You feel superior to people who aren't working on themselves but inadequate compared to people who seem more advanced than you. Your relationships become competitions rather than connections. Even worse, the trap makes you constantly second-guess your own experiences. When you feel happy, you wonder if you're just avoiding deeper issues. When you feel sad, you wonder what techniques you should use to process it. When you feel angry, you wonder if you're being unconscious. Your natural emotional responses become problems to solve rather than experiences to have. The most sophisticated version of this trap occurs in spiritual communities where the progress paradox becomes the enlightenment trap. People spend decades chasing awakening, non-dual realization, or liberation. Every insight becomes evidence that they're getting closer, but also evidence that they're not there yet. The seeking itself becomes the obstacle to what they're seeking, but the trap prevents them from seeing this. You cannot solve the progress paradox by achieving more progress. That's like trying to get out of quicksand by struggling harder. The more you try to escape through improvement, the deeper you sink into chronic inadequacy. The solution involves a fundamental shift in how you relate to growth itself, which feels terrifying to a mind caught in this trap. The third trap is the most personal because it attacks your relationship with yourself. I call it the authenticity mirage, and it turns your quest for genuine self-expression into a sophisticated form of self-alienation. This trap is particularly virulent in our current cultural moment, where being authentic has become the highest virtue. Everyone is encouraged to be yourself. follow your passion, live your truth. But the trap lies in the assumption that there's a fixed, discoverable self to be authentic to. Here's how it captures you. You become dissatisfied with aspects of your life that feel inauthentic. Maybe your job, your relationships, your lifestyle, your personality. This dissatisfaction is often valid and can motivate positive changes. But the authenticity mirage convinces you that somewhere inside you is a true self that, once discovered and expressed, will resolve this dissatisfaction. So you begin a search for your authentic self. You might try therapy, meditation, journaling, psychedelic experiences, or various forms of self-exploration, and you do discover things about yourself, preferences, values, desires, fears that you weren't previously aware of. This feels like progress, like you're getting closer to who you really are. But here's the trap. Every version of yourself that you discover and begin to identify with immediately becomes another constraint on your freedom to be anything else. Your authentic self becomes a new prison, just one that you chose rather than one that was imposed on you. You start policing your own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors to make sure they align with your discovered identity. If you've identified as a creative person, you feel pressure to be creative consistently. If you've discovered that you're introverted, you feel guilty about enjoying social situations. If you've realized you value freedom, you feel trapped by commitments. The mirage creates a particularly insidious form of self-judgment. When you behave in ways that contradict your authentic self-image, you don't just feel bad about the behavior, you feel bad about being fake, inauthentic, untrue to yourself. You've created a new standard to fall short of, a new way to be inadequate. Even more problematic, the authenticity mirage makes you suspicious of any part of yourself that seems to come from external influence. If you enjoy something because society tells you to enjoy it, that enjoyment becomes suspect. If you value something because your family values it, that value becomes questionable. The trap makes you paranoid about your own motivations. This creates an impossible situation. Everything about you has been influenced by external factors: your language, your values, your preferences, your personality patterns. If you reject everything that comes from outside influence, you're left with almost nothing. But if you accept external influences, you feel like you're being inauthentic. The trap becomes even more sophisticated when you realize that the very desire to be authentic is itself culturally conditioned. The idea that authenticity is valuable, that you should be yourself, that there's a true self to discover. All of these are cultural beliefs that you've internalized. So even your quest for authenticity is inauthentic by its own standards. The authenticity mirage also creates problems in relationships. You start demanding that others be authentic with you, but you're actually demanding that they conform to your idea of what their authenticity should look like. You become suspicious of anyone who seems to be performing or adapting to social situations, even though social adaptation is a normal and healthy human capacity. You might find yourself constantly checking in with yourself. Is this what I really want? Am I being true to myself? Is this authentic? But these questions assume there's a clear, stable answer to be found. In reality, your wants, yourself, and your authenticity are fluid, contextual, and constantly changing. The most cruel aspect of this trap is that it makes you alienated from your own spontaneous responses. When you have an immediate reaction to something, you don't just experience it, you evaluate whether it's authentically you. This creates a layer of self-consciousness that interferes with the very spontaneity that authentic expression requires. You cannot escape the authenticity mirage by discovering your true self, because the true self is not a thing to be discovered. It's a process to be lived. But the trap makes process feel insufficient and demands a fixed identity to be authentic too. This demand for fixity kills the very aliveness that authenticity is supposed to express. The fourth trap is the most invisible because it operates through the very mechanism you use to detect manipulation. I call it the autonomy illusion, and it convinces you that you're making independent choices while you're actually following scripts you cannot see. This trap is sophisticated beyond most people's imagination because it doesn't restrict your choices. It shapes your desires so that you want exactly what serves the systems that benefit from your compliance. You feel completely free because you're doing what you want to do, not realizing that what you want has been carefully cultivated. Here's how it works. Instead of being told what you cannot do, you're surrounded by subtle influences that make certain options more appealing, more visible, more socially rewarded. You're not forbidden from choosing alternatives. The alternatives are simply made less attractive, less obvious, less supported by your environment. Consider how this operates in consumer culture. You're not forced to buy products, but every aspect of your environment is designed to make consumption feel rewarding, necessary, and personally expressive. Advertising doesn't just inform you about products. It associates products with identity, status, values, and emotions that matter to you. When you buy something, you feel like you're expressing your personal taste, your individual style, your unique values. But your taste has been shaped by market research designed to predict and influence consumer behavior. Your style has been curated by fashion industries that create trends years in advance. Your values have been associated with brands through sophisticated psychological manipulation. The autonomy illusion makes this feel like freedom because you're choosing from multiple options, and your choices reflect genuine preferences, but your preferences themselves are the result of systematic influence that you don't consciously recognize. You're freely choosing from a menu that was designed to make you want what benefits others. This extends far beyond consumer choices into every aspect of life. Your career aspirations are influenced by cultural narratives about success and fulfillment. Your relationship expectations are shaped by media representations of romance and partnership. Your life goals are molded by social definitions of achievement and happiness. The trap is particularly powerful because it incorporates the language of individual choice and personal responsibility. When the system produces outcomes you don't like, you're encouraged to make better choices rather than question the system that shapes your choices. If you're unhappy, stressed, or unfulfilled, the solution is always individual rather than systemic. Social media has weaponized the autonomy illusion with unprecedented sophistication. The platforms don't tell you what to think. They show you content that confirms what you already think, making you feel intelligent and informed. They don't control your social connection. They algorithmically curate which connections you see and how you see them. You experience this as freely choosing what content to engage with, what posts to like, what videos to watch. But your choices are being predicted and influenced by machine learning systems that know more about your psychological patterns than you do. You're exercising choice within a system designed to make your choices predictable and profitable. The illusion extends to political and social beliefs. You feel like your political opinions are the result of careful consideration and personal values, but your information environment has been curated to support those opinions. Your social circles reinforce those beliefs. Your emotional associations with political topics have been shaped by how those topics are presented in your media ecosystem. When you encounter people with different political views, they seem brainwashed or irrational to you, but from their perspective, you seem brainwashed and irrational to them. Neither of you realizes that you're both products of different information environments, each designed to create conviction and certainty about specific viewpoints. The autonomy illusion makes questioning this feel like paranoia or conspiracy thinking. It encourages you to dismiss concerns about manipulation by pointing to your freedom to choose. But freedom to choose from options that have been pre-selected and pre-influenced isn't the same as genuine autonomy. The most sophisticated aspect of this trap is that it makes you defended. When someone suggests that your choices might be influenced by forces you don't recognize, you feel like they're attacking your intelligence, your agency, your competence. The trap turns criticism of the system into personal insults, making you its unconscious defender. You cannot escape the autonomy illusion by making different choices, because making different choices within the same system just demonstrates that the system is flexible enough to accommodate variety while maintaining control. Real escape requires recognizing the system itself, which feels impossible when the system provides everything you use to think with. The fifth trap is the most existentially devastating because it colonizes your relationship with meaning itself. I call it the purpose prison, and it transforms your natural human need for significance into a source of chronic anxiety and self-doubt. This trap operates by convincing you that you should have a clear, compelling life purpose that guides your decisions and gives meaning to your existence. It sounds reasonable, even inspiring, but the trap lies in treating purpose as something you find, discover, or figure out, rather than something you create and recreate moment by moment. Here's how it captures you. You look around and see people who seem to have their lives figured out. They talk passionately about their calling, their mission, their reason for being. This might be their career, their family, their cause, their art. They seem fulfilled, directed, meaningful, and you feel uncertain, scattered, lacking in direction. The trap convinces you that your dissatisfaction with life comes from not having found your purpose yet. If you could just discover what you're meant to do, everything would fall into place. Your choices would become obvious, your motivation would be sustained, your life would have clear direction and significance, so you begin searching for your purpose. You might try career assessments, personality tests, vision boarding, meditation, therapy, or various forms of soul searching. You analyze your strengths, your passions, your values, looking for the combination that reveals your true calling. And sometimes you do find something that feels like purpose. Maybe it's a career that excites you, a cause that moves you, a relationship that fulfills you, a creative project that absorbs you. For a while, everything feels aligned and meaningful. You think you've figured it out. But then something shifts. Maybe the initial excitement fades into routine. Maybe you encounter obstacles that make you question your choice. Maybe you achieve some success and realize it doesn't feel like you expected. Maybe you just change as a person and what once felt meaningful now feels constraining. This is where the purpose prison reveals its true cruelty. It makes you interpret any change in your relationship to your supposed purpose as a sign that you chose wrong, that you need to find your real purpose, that you're still not where you're supposed to be. The prison keeps you trapped in a cycle of seeking, finding, losing, and seeking again. The trap is particularly vicious because it makes periods of uncertainty feel like failures. When you don't know what you want to do with your life, when you feel confused about your direction, when you're exploring different possibilities, the purpose prison tells you this is time wasted, that you should have figured it out by now, that successful people don't experience this kind of confusion. But uncertainty and exploration are natural parts of being human. The pressure to have a clear purpose at all times actually interferes with the organic process of discovering what matters to you in different phases of your life. It makes you rush toward commitment when you need time to experiment. The purpose prison also creates a hierarchy of purposes where some life directions are treated as more legitimate than others. Having a big purpose like changing the world or creating art is seen as more meaningful than small purposes like raising children or maintaining friendships. This arbitrary ranking makes people feel inadequate about perfectly valid ways of creating meaning. Even worse, the trap makes you constantly second-guess your choices. Every career decision becomes existentially loaded. Every life change requires justification in terms of purpose and meaning. Every period of routine or stability feels like spiritual stagnation. You cannot just live your life. You have to live a meaningful life, which makes every moment subject to evaluation, the prison becomes most constraining when you do find something that feels like purpose, because now you feel obligated to maintain that sense of meaning. If your work stops feeling fulfilling, you feel like you're betraying your purpose. If your cause stops inspiring you, you feel like you're losing yourself. If your relationships stop feeling significant, you feel like you're failing at life. This creates what psychologists call purpose anxiety, a chronic worry about whether you're living meaningfully, whether you're wasting your life, whether you're on the right path. The anxiety makes it impossible to be present to the experiences you're actually having, because you're always evaluating whether they're meaningful enough. The most tragic aspect of the purpose prison is that it prevents you from recognizing the meaning that's already present in your life. Meaning doesn't come from having the right purpose. It emerges from engagement, connection, and attention to what's actually happening, but the trap makes you look for meaning in the wrong place, like looking for your glasses while wearing them. The sixth trap is the most socially reinforced because it masquerades as emotional intelligence and healthy communication. I call it the feelings fetish, and it turns your natural emotional responses into objects of obsessive analysis and management. This trap has become particularly prevalent in therapeutic culture, where the ability to identify, express, and process feelings is treated as the highest form of psychological sophistication. But the trap converts your emotions from functional responses into problems to be solved, experiences to be optimized, and signals to be decoded. Here's how it ensnares you. You start paying attention to your emotions in a way that you never did before. Maybe you learn about emotional intelligence, or start therapy, or read books about feelings. You develop a vocabulary for different emotional states and begin noticing when you're experiencing them. This seems positive at first. You become more self-aware, better at communicating your needs, more skilled at understanding others. These are genuine improvements, but gradually something shifts in your relationship to your own emotional experience. Instead of simply having feelings, you start having feelings about your feelings. When you're sad, you analyze why you're sad, whether the sadness is justified, what the sadness is trying to tell you, how long you should be sad, and what you should do about it. When you're angry, you examine the anger, trace its origins, evaluate its appropriateness, and plan how to express it constructively. The feelings fetish transforms every emotional experience into a project. You're not just feeling what you're feeling. You're managing your feelings, processing your feelings, working through your feelings, healing your feelings. Your emotions become like unruly children that need constant supervision and intervention. This creates a peculiar form of emotional self-consciousness where you're always watching yourself feel. Instead of being immersed in your experience, you're simultaneously experiencing and observing the experience. This observer stance actually interferes with the natural flow and resolution of emotional states. The trap becomes more sophisticated when you develop preferences about which emotions are acceptable and which need work. Anger becomes something to process rather than information about boundaries. Sadness becomes something to heal rather than a natural response to loss. Fear becomes something to overcome rather than wisdom about danger. You start categorizing your emotions as healthy or unhealthy, mature or immature, conscious or unconscious. But emotions don't actually fit into these categories. They're complex, contextual responses that serve multiple functions simultaneously. The attempt to judge them often interferes with their natural intelligence. The feelings fetish also affects your relationships. You begin expecting others to be as emotionally articulate as you've become. When someone can't perfectly express their feelings or doesn't want to analyze their emotions, you might perceive them as emotionally immature or avoidant. You might start managing other people's emotions the way you've learned to manage your own. Conversations become therapeutic sessions where every interaction is an opportunity to process feelings, share vulnerabilities, and practice emotional skills. But sometimes people need to just be together without having to examine and discuss everything they're experiencing. The constant focus on feelings can actually interfere with natural intimacy and connection. The trap becomes most problematic when you start believing that understanding your emotions should lead to controlling them. You develop expectations that if you do enough emotional work, you'll stop having inconvenient feelings. If you process your anger properly, you won't get angry inappropriately. If you heal your sadness, you won't be sad when you don't want to be. But emotions aren't problems to be solved. They're ongoing responses to life that will continue as long as you're alive and engaged with the world. The attempt to manage them out of existence creates a new form of emotional suppression, disguised as emotional sophistication. The feelings fetish also makes you vulnerable to emotional manipulation by people who speak the language of feelings but use it strategically. Someone can say all the right therapeutic words, express emotions in all the approved ways, and use emotional processing as a way to avoid accountability or manipulate outcomes. Most insidiously, the trap makes you distrust your immediate emotional responses in favor of analyzed, processed, and approved feelings. But your immediate responses often contain wisdom that gets lost in the analysis. Sometimes the first feeling is the truest feeling, before your mind has a chance to complicate it with interpretation and judgment. The seventh trap is the most intellectually seductive because it appeals to your desire for mental clarity and rational thinking. I call it the clarity compulsion, and it transforms your natural capacity for uncertainty and complexity into a desperate need for simple answers and clean categories. This trap operates by making you believe that confusion, ambiguity, and not knowing are problems to be solved rather than natural states of being in a complex world. It convinces you that intelligent people should have clear opinions, definite answers, and coherent worldviews about everything that matters. Here's how it captures you. You encounter complex issues, political, social, personal, philosophical, that don't have obvious answers. Instead of being comfortable with the complexity, you feel pressure to figure out where you stand. The clarity compulsion makes uncertainty feel like intellectual weakness or moral cowardice. So you start forming opinions quickly, choosing sides in debates, developing strong positions on topics you've only begun to understand. This feels like intellectual growth and moral clarity. You become someone who knows what they think about things, who can articulate clear positions, who doesn't waffle or equivocate. But the trap is that most complex issues require more nuance than any clear position can contain. When you force complexity into simple categories, you're not achieving clarity. You're achieving the illusion of clarity by ignoring everything that doesn't fit your simplified model. The clarity compulsion makes you intellectually lazy while making you feel intellectually rigorous. Instead of doing the difficult work of holding multiple perspectives simultaneously, considering contradictory evidence and living with provisional conclusions, you jump to definitive answers that eliminate discomfort but also eliminate accuracy. This becomes particularly problematic in our current information environment, where complex issues are constantly being reduced to headlines, talking points, and social media posts. The trap makes these oversimplifications feel satisfying rather than insufficient. You consume simplified explanations and feel informed rather than recognizing that you've been given intellectual junk food. The clarity compulsion also affects how you relate to your own growth and change. When you develop new understanding or change your mind about something, instead of seeing this as intellectual maturity, you might feel embarrassed about your previous confusion or worry about appearing inconsistent. But changing your mind is often a sign that you're learning and growing. Consistency in your opinions might actually indicate that you've stopped thinking. The trap makes intellectual flexibility feel like weakness when it's actually a strength. The compulsion becomes most dangerous when it's applied to people. Instead of appreciating the complexity and contradiction in human character, you develop fixed judgments about who people are based on limited information. Someone is either good or bad, trustworthy or untrustworthy, intelligent or stupid. This eliminates the possibility of seeing people as complex beings who contain multitudes. It makes you miss important information about others because it doesn't fit the clear categories you've created for them. It also makes you defend your judgments about people, even when evidence suggests you might be wrong. The clarity compulsion creates what psychologists call binary thinking, the tendency to see things in terms of either or rather than both, and everything becomes a choice between two alternatives rather than a complex situation with multiple valid perspectives and partial truths. This binary thinking extends to how you view yourself. You're either successful or unsuccessful, happy or unhappy, healthy or unhealthy, conscious or unconscious. The trap eliminates the possibility of being multiple things simultaneously or being in process between different states. Most insidiously, the clarity compulsion makes you suspicious of anyone who expresses uncertainty, who says, "I don't know," who acknowledges the complexity of issues, or who changes their mind. These responses feel like weakness or incompetence when they're actually signs of intellectual honesty and sophistication. The trap convinces you that clear answers are always available if you think hard enough, research thoroughly enough, or are intelligent enough. But many of life's most important questions don't have clear answers. Many situations require action without certainty. Many truths can only be lived rather than understood. You cannot escape the clarity compulsion by finding clearer answers because the compulsion itself is the problem. The escape requires developing comfort with uncertainty, appreciation for complexity, and tolerance for not knowing. But the trap makes these feel like intellectual failures rather than mature responses to a genuinely uncertain and complex world. The eighth and final trap is the most meta because it operates through your awareness of all the other traps. I call it the awakening trap, and it transforms your recognition of psychological manipulation into a new form of psychological imprisonment. This is the trap that catches people who consider themselves psychologically sophisticated, spiritually aware, or intellectually advanced. It uses your knowledge of how the mind works against you by convincing you that understanding the game means you've transcended it. Here's how it ensnares even the most aware individuals. You learn about cognitive biases, psychological manipulation, social conditioning, and mental traps. You become skilled at spotting them in others. You develop what feels like immunity to obvious forms of influence. You consider yourself awake to the various ways that minds can be controlled or deceived. This knowledge creates a sense of superiority and security. You feel like you're operating from a higher level of consciousness than people who are still caught in the obvious traps. You can see through propaganda, resist manipulation, and make more conscious choices. This feels like freedom. But the awakening trap uses this feeling of superiority as the very mechanism of entrapment. Your sense of being above or beyond the influence of psychological traps becomes your new blind spot. The trap convinces you that awareness is the same as immunity, that understanding the problem is the same as solving it. In reality, knowing about psychological traps often just makes you vulnerable to more sophisticated versions of the same traps. You become immune to crude manipulation but susceptible to refined manipulation. You learn to spot obvious biases but develop blindness to subtle biases. You escape simple forms of conditioning but fall into complex forms of conditioning. The awakening trap also creates what I call meta-bias, biases about your own lack of bias. You become convinced that your perspectives are more objective, your reasoning more rational, your choices more conscious than other people's. This meta-bias is often more powerful than ordinary biases because it comes with the sense that you've transcended bias. You start categorizing people based on their level of awareness. There are the unconscious people who are trapped in obvious illusions, and the conscious people who see through them. You naturally place yourself in the conscious category which creates a new form of us versus them thinking disguised as spiritual or psychological insight. This spiritual materialism, as it's sometimes called, transforms every insight into a new form of ego strengthening. Your understanding of non-dual awareness becomes a special identity. Your recognition of the illusion of free will becomes a marker of intellectual superiority. Your knowledge of psychological traps becomes evidence of your awakened state. The trap becomes most sophisticated when it incorporates the very concept of traps themselves. You become aware that there's such a thing as an awakening trap, and you think this awareness protects you from it. But the awareness of the awakening trap can itself become an awakening trap, creating infinite levels of meta-awareness that never actually lead to freedom. Even reading these words right now might be triggering the awakening trap. You might be thinking, yes, I can see how other people fall into this trap, but I'm aware of it now, so I won't fall into it myself. That thought, the confidence that awareness equals immunity, is exactly how the trap operates. The awakening trap also affects how you relate to your own psychological processes. When you notice yourself having an emotional reaction, instead of simply having the experience, you immediately analyze it through the lens of your psychological knowledge. Oh, I'm being triggered, or this is just my conditioning, or I'm caught in a thought pattern. This meta-commentary creates a subtle form of dissociation where you're always observing your experience rather than living it. You become the therapist of your own life, constantly diagnosing and treating your own mental states instead of simply being human. The trap convinces you that this observer stance is enlightenment or awakening, when it's actually a sophisticated form of spiritual bypassing. You use your knowledge about psychology to avoid the direct experience of being human, with all its messiness, irrationality, and unconsciousness. Most insidiously, the awakening trap makes you defensive about your own continued unconsciousness. When someone points out a blind spot you have, a bias you're displaying, or a trap you've fallen into, you resist the feedback because it threatens your identity as someone who's beyond such things. You might rationalize the resistance by finding flaws in the messenger, questioning their motives, or demonstrating how their criticism actually proves your point. The trap turns every challenge to your awakened status into evidence of other people's lack of awareness. The ultimate cruelty of the awakening trap is that it makes genuine growth more difficult. Real awakening requires ongoing humility, continuous learning, and constant willingness to discover new layers of unconsciousness. But the trap makes you invested in maintaining an image of having transcended unconsciousness. This creates a terrible paradox. The more you identify as awakened, the more you close yourself off to actual awakening. The more you see yourself as beyond psychological traps, the more trapped you become in the meta-trap of believing you're untrappable. The only way to work with the awakening trap is to recognize that awakening isn't a state you achieve, but a process you participate in. It's not something you have, but something you do. It's not a level you reach, but a direction you move in. But even this understanding can become another trap if you hold it as a superior perspective. In the end, perhaps the deepest wisdom is recognizing that being human means being perpetually vulnerable to psychological traps, including the trap of thinking you're not vulnerable to psychological traps. The acceptance of this vulnerability, paradoxically, might be the closest thing to genuine freedom from the traps themselves. But even that statement could be a trap if you use it to feel superior to people who haven't accepted their vulnerability yet. The rabbit hole goes all the way down, and every level you think you've mastered reveals new levels of complexity and potential self-deception. Welcome to the endless labyrinth of consciousness examining itself. Population: everyone who thinks they've found the exit. The most perfectly camouflaged trap of all is the belief that you've finally seen through all the camouflage. And yet, here you are, Reading these words, recognizing these patterns, perhaps seeing yourself in these descriptions, maybe the recognition itself is what matters, not the transcendence. Maybe the awareness itself is the gift, not the immunity from what you're aware of. The traps continue, the awareness continues. The dance between them continues, and in that continuation perhaps lies whatever freedom is actually available to consciousness, caught in the paradox of trying to understand itself. But don't take my word for it. After all, I might just be setting another trap.